reviewing the 2020 ABA draft. So if you go back in ABA history to 2020, the league was a lot different. The the worst team in the league was Utah. Utah was coming off of a abysmal season. We'll actually take a look real quick. So the teams that led the league were Carolina and Boston. This was back when Carolina was actually in the West, and Boston was led by Bruce Gregory, Kellen Anderson, who's currently now retired, and Michael Abui was a young, up-and-coming small forward, power forward. Abui is actually currently a free agent, is one of the biggest busts in NBA history. After looking like he might take off with Montreal, he just never established. Now, I digress. We go back to the draft. So the draft lottery was won in a shocker by New York. New York had actually had an okay record and came into the draft with a pretty solid team. Um, a lot of people were pretty hyped, even though they were one of the worst teams in the East. They were definitely not a bad roster. Unfortunately, though, Colton Coleman would end up leaving in free agency. Coleman's departure was definitely a big blow for this team that had honestly looked like they had potential, especially if they were able to pick up a star point guard. The biggest thing about this team was they had Coyote Diamond. Diamond has now grown into a legitimate superstar, but back then he was a raw offensive-based forward. Now, let's go to the draft and we'll see how every team did. So in 2020, there was several notable prospects, but the number one guy was the legacy player Kobe Beef Bryant, and Kobe was going to be boom or bust no matter what. Most people considered it one of three players were going to go number one. It was either going to be Kobe, J.R. McGee, or John Banks. But Banks had an injury that caused him to slide, and McGee, for some reason, was deemed not to be a superior player. And this would lead to Kobe going number one overall to New York. That was a horrible pick. Unfortunately for New York, Kobe just never really developed there. He'd end up being traded after two miserable seasons and would end up in New Orleans, purgatory for years before finally rejoining Denver and breaking out last season. But it's been a hard start for the 24-year-old, and he hasn't quite become the player that you'd hope for your first overall pick. The second overall pick was J.R. McGee. He is the epitome of disappointment. He is not a bad player. In fact, he's a borderline all-star just a few seasons ago, and you could argue last season he was a borderline all-star. Pittsburgh picked the obvious number two player here. Unfortunately, the curse of Pittsburgh was real. McGee would miss most of his rookie season, and since then he's bounced around the league. He's now on his fourth team, third big role on our roster, and he's supposed to be one of Dallas's premier players with a massive contract. But he has yet to really live up to that. If we go back to the draft here, we can see the third guy overall was John Banks. Banks was picked by Toronto in what was a great pick. However, Banks would soon be traded, shockingly, to Vancouver in exchange for Antoine Clark and a first-round pick. Antoine Clark was not a bad player by any means. He averaged 14 points per game just last season, and in his first season with Toronto, he would end up averaging 10 and 3, but he never really became a superstar. His best season was a 14 and 9 season with Toronto before departing for New York as a free agent. Was Clark worth giving up on Banks? I don't think so. Banks, meanwhile, well, his career started slow. He only played 7 games in 2 seasons. However, once he became a big-time role player, he'd end up winning an MVP, 2 championships, a Finals MVP, and being signed to a mega deal. This is a franchise player and deserved his pick regardless of time missed. Now, if we look back at the other draft, if we look back at the original draft, we can also see that 4 and 5 would be All-Stars Richard Hopkins and Marcus McPherson. These were both great picks, along with John Banks. Slamtown Robinson is a tricky question. He is a great player who's had an on-again, off-again career. At 28, he's already shown extreme signs of decline and never reaching his huge potential. But he is still one of the best shutdown swingmen in the league and remains a key part now of Miami's championship aspirations going forward. He might be one of the best players to have never won a championship. I don't even know if he's gone. Actually, he might have won one with Vancouver before they moved him. Yes, he won one with Vancouver before they moved him. He's actually one of the best defensive players in league history. Career 2.4 steals. Like it or not, he was also a good pick, meaning that there was 4 consecutive good picks after a really rough start. This is where we get into craziness territory. Ali Archibald, he just started developing as a quality player and is now the highest overall of his career at 60 overall. Prior to that, he was looking like a colossal bust. However, I don't believe it's really anywhere near enough to justify the fact that he went 7th overall when you have a guy like Hubert Franzwanowicz, hopefully I pronounced that right, who went at number 8. Hubert would end up having a tumultuous career. He's been traded multiple times, but he spent most of his time in Anaheim, which was originally Chicago, and then he went to New York for a season before being traded. He is probably best known for being incredibly young and being a really big part of 2 championship teams and last season's surprise Finals MVP with the super exciting Showtime New Jersey Americans. Now, if we continue to review the draft, after him, you'll see AJ Lewis, who he could have gone later. He's been a great role player, but that's all he's been while in Detroit. Cortland Davis, kind of the same thing. He was part of those really, really disappointing 460 overall, not even close to the playoff St. Louis teams. He puts up great stats, but he's horribly overpaid. The two of them have combined for just 10 win shares. However, they are currently, I believe, getting paid over 25 million combined. Mustafa Saranger just started breaking out. He's been traded several times, and in all honesty, I don't really know what his role is. He's primarily played for good teams, and that doesn't look to change. However, despite playing for good teams, he's put up amateur stats, but remains a fairly high overall. He has a career 4.7 estimated wins added, which is nothing. Somehow has a ring. Overall, I'd say he's a bust, but more on circumstance than performance. Now we'll go through a little bit quicker here, just so we can keep this video fairly short. Other players drafted in the draft that I would consider sizable busts would be the first player ever cut, that have been drafted, Travis Truck Grosse at 12. He was cut by Billy after a miserable Progs. This isn't even Billy's fault. He just busted thanks to Progs. We'll actually highlight the busts here, in my opinion, the guys that could have gone later, that should have gone later. And you'll see Chris Robinson, complete bust. He's only a 50 overall. Meanwhile, he's surrounded by 270s, including A.O. McKinney, Jalen Olakabi, both of whom have become absolute superstars. And Ty Jackson, whose slide is unparalleled. He is one of the best players, if not the best player in this draft. And in my opinion, would have gone first overall in a redraft over Olakabe, over McKinney, over Hubert, over McPherson, over Hopkins, and over Banks. Why? Because the dude's a two-way superstar. He had a huge breakout, and he's just 26 years old. Only Hubert is younger than him, and other stars are the same age, and they don't provide nearly as much two-way play. Jake Trott, though, might be the biggest. I believe he's actually the worst player in league history at -5 estimated wins. I was actually going through this earlier. He is the worst player in league history. It's just absolutely funny. I believe he actually signed with Anaheim. So we'll see how that goes. Stanley Foster was the first player to ever be drafted and then retire. He actually has a brother who you guys might know is Terrence Foster, who's currently a big disappointment over in Cincinnati. I guess the family just shares in disappointment. Kashmir Jolly, honestly, this is where a guy like him would go, but his oh wow, he's at -5 EWA, already proving me wrong. Great. He's also really bad. Him and Chott, not great. Brema had a great career. He's probably at the end of his career now. But for a late first round pick, playing 373 games, score 10 points, and have 5 rebounds is pretty reliable. And frankly, Houston had an above average starter for his entire career. And I don't think you can consider that a bust in the late 20s. Uh, Jared Ybarra never developed, just held up bottom bench roles. And frankly, there was better picks available at the time. One of those better picks, in my opinion, would be Will Samano, Wes Starkey, or Goran Dragic, all of whom would have been better than Nico Robe, who's also already out of the league. He was picked by New Jersey, and I guess he was traded. Yeah, he was traded to Cincinnati, and he wouldn't even be re-signed by a team that's hurting for depth every year. I guess that just tells you the type of talent you're dealing with here. highlight a few really quality late round picks here. You have Colin Thompson become a legitimate star for Montreal after leaving Dallas. I have to say it's disappointing whenever you see a guy break out after leaving a team. Especially had he done stuff in Dallas, some of those early Dallas teams could have been really solid. He would actually go to Anderson Duffy and then to Montreal. And in Montreal has become a legitimate superstar. He might be a little overpaid, but he should put up some crazy numbers this year. Kyle Tyler would be one of the most overpaid players. Now, actually, might be deserving of a mega deal. Very strange career for him. Basically, he was highly paid after his rookie contract with Vancouver. I think he might have won a ring with them. Yeah, no, not win a ring with Vancouver. All right, not that time at least. Drafted by Vancouver in the second round, had 2 solid seasons for a contending team. Went to Baltimore on a massive contract. They let him get taken in the expansion draft. After getting drafted in the expansion draft, guess what? Back to Vancouver on a big trade. Had a big contract. Everyone thought he was overpaid. Helped a contender win a championship, and then gets another big contract. This guy just keeps locking out into big ass contracts for limited pay, thanks to Vancouver. It's really an interesting cycle. But no matter what, one of the best two-way bigs in the league. More of a true forward center, to be honest. And other notable second-round players will include super slider Ian Noel, Barriones, who's had a few sizable roles, including teams in Cincinnati and Las Vegas. You'll also see Brian Sanders, who's currently a role player for Milwaukee. Ryan Kawade, he's probably been traded like 3 times, if I recall. It's just a career prospect. And interestingly enough, this is also the draft that he doesn't appear to be listed, but Kinley Johnson would be undrafted in, and he would later win one-time Sixth Man of the Year. Overall, draft, not bad, but this draft was not a super deep one. It really only had about 15 quality players and was very top heavy. But the first overall pick, if you're doing a redraft, probably would have been Ty Jackson, Marcus McPherson, John Banks. So Banks going to Toronto, and hopefully they would have kept him. Yeah, I'd say if I'm saying big draft winner, would probably be Utah and Vancouver. And maybe Anaheim. Big draft loser would be probably Cincinnati, Montreal, and New York.